I cannot believe that a press conference about COVID ended up as a sort of rap battle between Chris Whitty, the Prime Minister, and Nicki Minaj.
Well, a lot of strange things have happened in the last few years in politics, and this was one of them.
Yeah, so basically what happened was Nicki Minaj had tweeted something about her cousin's friend in Trinidad had a very strange side effect from the COVID vaccine, which we're not going to go into, also because it's not true.
And it would put you off your tea.
Yeah.
By the way, not everybody listening or watching might know who she is.
She's a pop star, rapper.
There we go.
Big social media presence with a lot of... And she's just a big presence generally. And anyway, so Chris Whitty, Chief Medical Officer, was asked about it. He was furious with anyone who spreads disinformation. And then, of course, Boris Johnson, pop fan that he is, waded in there.
I'm not familiar with the works of Nicki Minaj, as I probably should be, but I am familiar with Nikki Kanani, superstar GP of Bexley, who's appeared many times on before you, who will tell you that vaccines are wonderful and everybody should get them. So I prefer to listen to Nikki Kanani.
Which prompted her Minajness to then tweet this. I love him, even though I guess this was a diss. The accent, yes, boo. Emoji, 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 emoji.
Now, the strange thing about that for me was that an enormous American star was watching a UK government press conference about coronavirus. I found that pretty curious.
Well, everyone wanted to know what was in the autumn and winter plan, even Nicki Minaj. And then someone called Laura Kuenssberg sent a tweet saying, 2021, everyone. I guess just trying to sum up the bizarre combination of things.
How strange this is. And it turned out she was paying attention to that too.
Yeah, Nicki Minaj is she's probably listening and watching this because she's such a big fan of British politics. She then replied, yes, 2021. When jackasses I can't believe I'm reading this out in front of you.
I didn't think you were going to read that bit out either.
I can't bring myself to look at you while I'm reading this out.
I've heard a lot worse, Adam. I've heard a lot worse.
Yes, 2021, when jackasses hang on to my every tweet but can't decipher sarcasm and humour and can't read. Go away, Dumbo.
Oh, well, I was quite fond of Dumbo. He's a very sweet little elephant. There we are.
All right, Dumbo, should we carry on with this episode of Newscast?
Newscast. Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And Laura in the same studio, and we are still 2 metres apart.
Yes, that's still the rules for us.
That's still part of our winter plan.
So that's, I don't know, actually.
I don't know.
That could take us for quite a long way through the rest of the year, and then maybe even... And of course, the thing about winter in the NHS, do you remember when Jeremy Hunt told us on Newscast that winter in the NHS actually lasts till April the next year?
And it's only September, and we've been talking about it all week. Anyway, something else very big and important happened this week in Westminster, did it not?
The reshuffle, and it's pretty much nearly done as we're recording this on Thursday evening. But let's recap the big winners, because what's been happening today on Thursday is the kind of the lower rungs of the ladder. The top rungs were done on Wednesday, and so I mean the big winners are Liz Truss, who's now the Foreign Secretary, only the second woman to ever hold that role, the first Conservative woman to have the job. And then Nadhim Zahawi, kind of probably rewarded for the vaccine rollout.
I think so, yes, I think no doubt.
With now being Education Secretary, big challenge about how to get everyone caught up from all the learning that they missed during the pandemic, and which of course is very unevenly spread across the country. And then I think probably is this the biggest surprise? Nadine Dorries as Culture Secretary?
I think it probably is the biggest surprise, along with Robert Buckland, who's one of the 3 full cabinet ministers to lose his job. He was the Justice Secretary and he was off, as is Robert Jenrick, who was the Housing Secretary in charge of all sorts of tricky things like planning and cladding, that crisis after Grenfell. It was a bad day to be called Robert. And Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary. And that was no surprise, I think it's fair to say, after the sort of palaver over all sorts of things. He was off and out. But there were some movers as well, and big names here.
Yes, so Dominic Raab, former Foreign Secretary, is now the Justice Secretary. Some people saying that suits him because he's got a bit of a legal background, although I'm never actually totally sure exactly what his legal background was. And I'll be really intrigued to see if he does anything with that add-on title he got, the bonus title of Deputy Prime Minister.
After a black belt move, he ended up getting that bauble, which, as I understand it, Boris Johnson did not necessarily intend to give him at the beginning of their meeting, but he was cross about moving and cross about he perceives as I understand it, being blamed for some of the debacle in terms of the Afghan withdrawal. Interesting, Michael Gove, of course, a hugely prominent figure in politics for a long time now, has become the housing secretary, but also he has responsibility for the union and something we're going to talk about in this programme, the mysterious levelling up. And then finally...
Yeah, another kind of surprise here. Oliver Dowden, the kind of well-respected culture secretary, who people thought maybe he'll go to education. I think maybe some of his team thought maybe he could go to the cabinet office because he's quite a sort of organiser type. He's going to go and organise the Conservative Central Office, or CCHQ, whatever it's called now.
CCHQ.
Conservative Party co-chair, so sort of getting them ready for the election.
But further down the ranks, though, and we're still getting new names coming in tonight, lots of people, lots of churn, and a couple of quite surprising moves. One, Nick Gibb, who was the schools minister for a long time, widely respected in the sector. And another one, John Whittingdale.
John, hello. Thanks for coming on to Newscast.
Thank you.
So what actually happened this morning? And can I just, before we get into the story, say that you're a good sport to come on and talk to newscasters on the day that your job is gone. So thank you for sharing what really happened.
Well, I mean, I think like a lot of my colleagues, I had a call actually last night from the Prime Minister who said to me that he was grateful for all that I'd done, but it was the usual thing about needing to make room for young and up-and-coming Tory MPs. And I'm young and probably no longer up and coming, so to that extent I could sort of understand. I did feel that I was doing a reasonably good job. There's an awful lot going on which I was dealing with in DCMS, and so I'm very sad to stop doing it, but I wish my successor every success with it, and I'll continue to help them in any way I can.
Yeah, because you were stewarding some big things through your department, and some things that I understand are government priorities, like the potential privatisation of Channel 4. Do you think your departure is kind of damaging to those projects then?
Well, I mean, I had 3 responsibilities, each of which was looking at really quite considerable legislative change. There's not just Channel 4, but the whole future of public service broadcasting and how we bring it up to date. There is also the data reforms, which we are now able to make as a result of Brexit, where we can set our own data laws. And thirdly, I was overseeing the gambling review, where there is no doubt that we do need to do more to protect those people who are vulnerable. So there were a lot of big things, and the trouble with reshuffles is that you bring in ministers who normally do not have the depth of knowledge. I was very unusual when I first went to Secretary of State because I'd spent 10 years chairing the Select Committee, so I did know the subject, but that is quite uncommon. And so, you have to then spend time with the ministers getting up to speed before they can really start taking decisions.
And that is one of the things about the department you've just left, actually. I mean, the Secretary of State has gone. Oliver Dowden's gone off to be chairman of the Tory party. Caroline Dinenage, who was one of your colleagues at Department of Culture too, she's gone. And you've gone, and you've worked in the sector for a long time. So do you think the government will just crack on with what you've just described, really big changes in this part of the political landscape?
They must, because all 3 of the areas that I described are very important. We need to update legislation. Data represents a huge opportunity post-Brexit. Public service broadcasting needs to be brought into the modern age to deal with the rise of the streaming services and the shift in the way people consume TV. And gambling, there is no doubt that the Gambling Commission needs a review, and that we need to look at putting in place greater protection. All these are areas where whoever is in charge, we're going to need to make those changes.
But nevertheless, you're very identified with this idea of selling Channel 4 so it's no longer a public service broadcaster. Do you think the fact that you're no longer there and you're so associated with that policy suggests maybe the government's a bit more lukewarm about going ahead with that than they were maybe 2 days ago?
Well, the first thing to say is that Channel 4 will remain a public service broadcaster, whatever happens to the ownership of it. We are completely committed to that. But I would say that obviously the government's decision to consult on the ownership of Channel 4 was a decision taken by the Secretary of State, Oliver Dowden, but as a result of cabinet discussion and ultimately with the authority and support of the Prime Minister. Now, that has not changed. And the arguments why it is necessary to look at the future of Channel 4 have not changed either. So I don't think you should read into it any shift in the policy. Personalities don't necessarily determine policies, and this is something that the government was agreed needed to be considered.
And what about the BBC? Because, of course, as you said, it's a huge area for the government, the big landscape of public service broadcasting. And it's been suggested in the last couple of weeks that the government's view is that the licence fee will not and should not rise at the same level as inflation. Is that your view?
Well, I'm not going to comment on what decision ultimately is going to be announced about the level of a licence fee.
But you can now. You're a free man.
I was involved in those discussions, and there hasn't been a final decision taken. It's something which may well be a new Secretary of State will want to look at.
But is it your view that that's the right decision?
Well, I'm not going to tell you what my view of the decision is before the decision is announced.
But is that your view, though? Not the decision, but is it your view that the licence fee shouldn't go up with inflation?
Look, I am a huge supporter of the BBC. The BBC needs to be secure with a financial backing, but on the other hand, we have to recognise that these are hard times. Households are under considerable pressure, and it's a balance that needs to be drawn, and this is a 5-year settlement. But honestly, I'm not going to tell you what the government is likely to announce, even though I'm no longer a minister. Nevertheless, it was something that I was closely involved in, and I will wait for the government to reach and announce its final decision.
Some ministerial habits die very hard.
It might be.
Now, let's talk about Nadine Dorries, who it was a surprise to lots of people in Westminster, even incredibly clued in, experienced people, that she got elevated to be Culture Secretary. If you had a PhD in the work of that department, what qualification has she got?
Well, I delivered, rather curiously, Oliver Dowden's speech last night to the Royal Television Society because I was still in post at that time, even though he had gone off to be transferred to the chairmanship of the Conservative Party. And in the audience,
reshuffles are just really weird, actually. Can I just be clear?
Strange. but it was pointed out, because Nadine's appointment had just been announced, that, of course, one of the things she is best known for is having been a contestant on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. So,
did you vote for her?
She has some experience of television as a result. But no, I know Nadine and I like her. I'm sure she'll do a good job. But, she's come from having been wrestling with COVID in the Department of Health for quite some time. She's going to have to get up to speed with some very different issues, and ones which are quite complicated and challenging. I wish her every success. I'm happy to do what I can to help. The one thing which the Secretary of State, whoever holds that post, cannot do is to interfere in the editorial direction. The Secretary of State and the government appoints the chair and the board. The Director General is appointed by the board. We set the licence fee, something which is about to happen, but we don't tell the BBC what they can and cannot broadcast. That is something which I've always absolutely believed in, and I'm sure that will continue to be the position.
As someone who knows Nadine Dorries, do you think temperamentally she may be sort of tempted to go into that zone, and maybe she might need to be held back?
There is nothing wrong with Secretary of State, or indeed anybody, expressing views about the content of particular programming. She will have the opportunity to talk on a regular basis to both the Director General and the Chair of the BBC, and I'm sure she will express her view. But we have an independent BBC in editorial terms, and that's something which I believe we need to protect.
And John, overall, I mean, you've been part of not just this government that you've just left, but others. If you look at the shape of the team that Boris Johnson has lined up, does it make sense to you? Is there a kind of coherence to it that you can identify for newscasters? Or is it sort of Boris Johnson, the pragmatist, thinking, well, I want to make a few changes and move a few people around, but maybe there isn't any big ideology behind it?
Well, of the big changes that were made, some had been sort of speculated about for some considerable time and therefore cannot have come as a complete surprise. Others, I think, came out of the blue. I think, I understand that every Prime Minister has to make room to allow people to be brought forward. That's never an easy thing. I also quite recognise that the Prime Minister is keen to have a front-facing cabinet that reflects modern Britain. So you need to have representation from, across the whole of the United Kingdom. You need to have, moving towards greater gender balance, more diversity. All of those things are absolutely necessary. But equally, I think it's no bad thing to have a bit of experience around that table and people who, have got a good grasp of the detail of the jobs they're being asked to do.
Absolutely not a reference to Nadine Dorries, I'm completely sure.
Are you a bit
No,
cross?
it wasn't
I
particularly
know.
You sound, as an experienced politician, you sound pretty sanguine about the whole thing. But are you a bit cross? I mean, it sounds as if you've just explained, very clearly that basically you lost your job because Boris Johnson wanted a team that looked different, not necessarily people who'd be better able to do the job.
Look, I was... There were only 2 members of the entire government who had been elected before 2000. They were myself and Nick Gibb. Both of us are no longer in those jobs. So to that extent, clearly it was about it was to do with refreshing and bringing forward up and coming members, and I understand that. I was enjoying the job. It's something I've spent a lot of time on DCMS in various different positions. I chaired the Select Committee for 10 years. I was Secretary of State for time. I was Shadow Secretary before that. It's a job I love, and obviously I'm sad to give it up. But that doesn't mean I can't continue to contribute, even though I'm not sitting in the Minister's chair. So, yeah, I'm disappointed, but that's politics. All of us who go into politics know that it's a very uncertain and occasionally quite brutal business.
Interesting, though, that it seems to be the only job in Britain where actually your boss can discriminate based on age. That would be illegal anywhere else.
Well, I wasn't told that was the reason,
okay.
but I accept that. I've been around quite a long time in Parliament compared to, particularly, we've got a huge new intake of people who've just arrived, all of whom are very able and ambitious, and the Prime Minister obviously is going to want to demonstrate that talent will be rewarded, and you can't go on promoting people unless some people are asked to stand aside. But that doesn't make it any easier, particularly if those people, and I'm not talking about necessarily about myself, I'm talking about 1 or 2 of my other colleagues who have stepped down in the last 24 hours, who were doing a very good job and did nothing which merited their removal.
Just last question, John. What are you going to do with yourself? Fancy doing swapsies with Nadine Dorries, you going into the jungle next time round?
I don't think I'll be in the jungle. And this is the answer all MPs give, but it is true. It's that, I love representing my constituents in Malden, and they will be still my priority. And that's a big job, whether or not you're doing anything in government.
So you don't want us to reshuffle your number out of our phones?
No, I'm very happy for it to stay there.
Well, we're very happy that you gave us time today on the day that it was announced that you were leaving your post. Thank you very much indeed, John Whittendale, for being a good sport and talking about your departure on the day it happened. Thank you.
Now, Laura, should we give newscasters the authentic Westminster experience of a reshuffle, which is talking about it even more?
Yeah, I think so, because we've been talking about it all week and last week. When do you remember? Newscasters might remember. We said, hasn't happened this week. Bet it might be on for next week. And there we were.
Now, Chris Mason isn't here in his socially distanced booth of news, but the former Education Secretary and founder of the Social Mobility Pledge, Justine Greening, is in there now. Hello, Justine.
Hi, how are you, Adam?
Very well, thank you. So, you've been out of the front line of politics and contributing in another way, but does that mean you're still totally glued to the reshuffle gossip on social media, or do you live life like a normal person now?
It's a bit of both. I do still get this Pavlovian pit in my stomach feeling whenever there's a reshuffle on. So I think...
What, in case they call you back in?
No, it is totally Pavlovian. Just the weirdest experience you can go through. Normal jobs, you get to apply. If you want to leave, you probably resign and then do 3 months and move on. Cabinet reshuffles are the opposite. You get jobs you never applied for, and when you're not ready to leave, you absolutely often end up, as Robert Buckland did yesterday, unfortunately, find yourself leaving. So they are totally bizarre and unsettling experiences. In a sense, it's like the political equivalent of a cold shower. It's a necessary evil at times, but I don't think anyone really enjoys them.
So your big thing now is social mobility. So this idea that your background doesn't stop you or affect where you actually end up when you're in the world of work. So let's look at what that means in terms of the new look cabinet. And our colleague Joseph, who is a number cruncher extraordinaire, has done some amazing stats for us. So the new cabinet is people attending cabinet is 27% female, which is up. So that's a good thing, isn't it?
Well, I think it's interesting because you almost need to look at who's coming into the pipeline and then how they get on in it, if you see what I mean, in terms of talent. So when you look at the percentage of women in Boris Johnson's cabinet, broadly they reflect the fact that a quarter of Conservative MPs are female. So you can see if the Conservative Party wants more female cabinet ministers, it probably needs to widen the pipeline in the first place, because it looks like when women are in Parliament, they are making their way through to the top table.
And then we've got a whole other metrics we could do here. For example, people who went to Oxford or Cambridge for university, that has fallen slightly, but is still about 45% around that very squished table.
So, Justine, what do you make of it when you hear of that?
Well, I think you can almost contrast the situation on women in cabinet to the situation on state-educated people in cabinet. And there, I think, Boris Johnson's latest cabinet has around, I think, 62% of its people around the table educated privately, compared to 7% in the population, and compared to a Tory party in Parliament of 41% of Conservative MPs are privately educated. So there's a double challenge, isn't there, for Boris Johnson, a Prime Minister that says talent spread evenly, but opportunities not.
Now, who do you think has got the toughest gig in that new cabinet? I mean, you were an education secretary, but you were also at the Department for of Transport and also the Department for International Development. You've done lots of different jobs. Mm-hmm. But if you think about education, Gavin Williamson has had a, what shall we say, choppy time in there. Who do you think has got the toughest gig?
It's a great question. I think probably Michael Gove, actually. I think his inbox doesn't have a lot of things that aren't exceptionally hard, whether it's planning, whether it's some of the leasehold reform stuff, whether it's the really challenging question, particularly for lots of people living in cities, of cladding. There's a range of challenges for Michael Gove. And I think the other challenge he's got is he's in charge of levelling up. And I think it's a lot harder to do a levelling up strategy where different places and communities have different levelling up challenges. And the issue is to let 1,000 flowers bloom, I think. And that means having a national architecture of levelling up goals, but then allowing local communities to really work out for themselves how they put those plans in place. The role of government on levelling up is actually to be an enabler rather than a director on levelling up. And I think that's Michael Gove's challenge.
Now, you know the Department for Education and the school system like the back of your hand, having been an education secretary. Is there a way that when the pandemic struck, Gavin Williamson could have handled that crisis in a better way and done something differently?
I think what he really needed to do was to break down the challenges that schools and children and parents were going to face into much more actionable chunks. And I think what you ended up with was almost diktats and guidelines coming out of the DfE to schools that were really in different situations in different parts of the country, and again needed something that was much more tailored. I think the laptop programme really should and could have been nailed much earlier to make sure that being on the wrong side of the digital divide wasn't going to stop young people and children from studying. I think we could have mobilised a lot more community spaces for children to be able to have the quiet spaces they need to keep studying, socially distanced if that's what it took. I think there's a whole range of areas actually where we could have had a real call to action. We did that on the NHS, and we really saw lots of volunteers and people, businesses step forward to try and play their role during the pandemic. I would have loved to have seen what that looked like to help our children and our teachers and schools get through the pandemic more easily as well.
It will be very interesting to see what Nadeem Zahawi and all the other people with new jobs in this reshuffle do with their new briefs. But Justine, just right at the very beginning of our chat, you said that a reshuffle was a bit like a cold shower. Somebody who was in government around the same time as you told me that in one of the reshuffles where you were being given a cold shower, you were being moved from transport to DFID, and I'm told on fairly good authority, you weren't very happy about it, and you locked yourself in Andy Coulson's office, refusing to move. Is that scurrilous and untrue, or what really happened?
I certainly don't remember that, but I do remember that I was livid at being moved after just 11, 12 months at transport when I was just getting going. And I felt I had a lot more to do at that department. I guess it comes down to levelling up. I suppose I felt it was unfair. And this Prime Minister who'd had so much opportunity in his life was suddenly taking this plum cabinet role that I'd really thrown myself into away from me. Of course, what I didn't realise at the time was that going and doing international development was going to be, for me on a very personal level, a completely transformative experience. I absolutely loved that role. But yes, that reshuffle, I actually learned a lot from it, Laura, because I didn't handle it well, I felt, afterwards. I think it's a big transition when literally one morning you're in one role and then suddenly by the afternoon you're in the next. And I think it's quite hard sometimes to sort of unplug yourself from one portfolio and then suddenly go into another one. And I'm generally pretty steady person, so I probably lose my temper about once every 5 years. But unfortunately for David Cameron, that was the time I did lose my temper.
And did you stay just sit in? I mean, maybe it wasn't Andy Coulson's office. Maybe this is scurrilous.
I genuinely don't remember doing that, but I just do remember being,
cross.
Just very, very cross and feeling like, David Cameron had put me into transport when he had one Heathrow policy, and then he changes his mind on Heathrow, which I thought was a wrong thing anyway, and then expected me to do a flip-flop. And I'm like, well, that's not how I work. I think through my policies, I work out what I think the right answer is, and I don't just go like that because someone else who clearly hasn't done that then changes their mind. So there you go.
She didn't confirm the sit-in then, but we're very glad that you sat in Chris Mason's cupboard this week. Thank you, Justine.
Thank you. Great to have you on as ever.
Right, let's go back to where we began. So you've had a sort of A-lister showbiz engagement this week with the whole Nicki Minaj.
With the reshuffle. The reshuffle.
Yes, and the Nicki Minaj
saga.
Reshuffle,
yes.
I've had my own showbiz moment.
Have you?
Because this morning on BBC Breakfast,
So
I
showbiz.
was on after Pam Ayres, the poet.
Amazing.
And this is the massively cringy thing that happened afterwards. I wish I hadn't done this. I've just scribbled a few lines of poetry. Should I give it a go in tribute to Pam Ayres to talk about the reshuffle in verse? Okay. The government says it's appointing more women. Liz Truss, the Foreign Office she's now in.
Okay, it was limited. Hold on, Adam. Can you hold? Can we get? What's the opinion?
Give up the day job, I would say.
Oh, Adam, you look quite red-faced, but
Yeah.
you obviously really hated it, given that you've just played it to everyone again.
Not my choice. But what's good, though, is when I do publish a poetry anthology, I'll have Pam Ayres' quote on the back saying, don't give up the day job.
Well, I just wrote one while we were listening to
Okay.
yours. Reshuffles are mad. They make some people feel sad, but they're part of the gig, and sometimes they're big. I think that's...
Brilliant. I mean, don't give up the day job.
I got to 4 lines, though.
Yeah, true.
You had 2.
I mean, it was a live breaking news scenario there. It's like there's only so much you can do.
Oh,
I feel I should
dear.
now have a newscast goodbye poem, but I mean, I'm all poetried out for this week.
Tune in again next week or to the podcast tomorrow. Verse with Adam will be available.
There's been a reshuffle. What a load of kerfuffle. Bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.